Welcome to a very special program. And even before I say anything else, happy Hispanic Heritage Month. This is a very special program on Hispanic Heritage Month. I'm naming it number two because just last Tuesday, we did one in Spanish, and my guests, I was very pleasantly surprised at how well they communicate in Spanish. I did not know that they could communicate that well in Spanish. So again, Hispanic Heritage Month. Let me introduce our guests today, and they are, I'll just the way I see them is Pete Dimas, Frank Barrios, and Petra Falcon. Welcome, friends of my friends and friends of ARP.
Buenos días, buenas tardes y feliz día de la independencia a todos.
Definitely. Yes. So we would like to celebrate, right? This is a time of reflection. This is a time of consideration. This is a time of celebration. And even yesterday, I said a little something that I would like us to consider as we move on with the conversation. But uh, people who grew up in this country, yes, they may celebrate independencias, right? But we have that and more, right? Because we also have our history in this country on this side of the border, so to speak. So we have way more than just as reference, right? As reference the independencia. We have uh, every one of those folks, ladies, women, men who have worked so hard, who have fought so hard to create the space that we now enjoy. I always say that I came to this country and everything was the plate, the table was served, and many have done the hard work, and I'm so appreciative. And I know you are part of that group, and your parents and your grandparents. So let's get started. I would like to ask each of you, a question here and there, but the whole thing is to talk about Hispanic Heritage Month. Pete Dimas, would you relate to us the history of this declaration? I suppose it was a declaration at some point in history of someone that they gave us a whole month. Typically it's a day, but now we have a whole month to celebrate. Take it away, Peter. Take us through the history, if you don't mind.
Well, I think it's pretty soon. It won't even be a month. It'll be the whole year.
Oh, wow.
Because you don't really have Anglo-American month, do you?
No.
So, because they're perceived as the majority. Hispanic Heritage Month actually, as a season, if you will, is really rooted in the politics of the '60s. As far as the celebration is concerned, we can talk about how long the presence of people who speak Spanish has been, and that's centuries. We can talk about the linkages from, let's say, here in the Phoenix area with Mexico, Central Mexico. We can talk about that in the millennium. In other words, we're not only rooted here, not only migrated here, but it's been here for centuries, even before there was a Jamestown or anything like that in the East Coast. So we have a long presence here. On top of that, the ability to live in this environment is the technology and the legal framework to make sure that it works for everybody. That's part of our heritage also. Even the term for taking care of the ditches, zanjeros, that's part of the old legal traditions that we have. So even the development of the United States in this part of the country is deeply rooted in our presence here and our expertise, and then in service into the military. Like, for example, my dad was a veteran of World War II, fought in the Battle of the Bulge, that sort of thing. I'm a veteran myself, and I grew up knowing that I was an American, but I was something more. Okay. So we have that, but there's this, for over a century, this attempt to pretend that we didn't exist. And that dealt with commerce and real estate speculation, all those sorts of things. But What happens is when this area becomes part of the United States, much of the leadership is Mexicano. If you go to Tucson, especially, it's quite clear. Mexicanos, whether it's Ochoa or Samaniego or Carrillo or any of these people, they were the leaders, and they helped set up things, anchor the place with their connections to commerce in Mexico and with the Santa Fe Trail. There's a lot of stuff here. But what happened in the 1890s is the first time after the railroads get here is the Mexicano leadership found that it had to organize. And in order to do this, they formed what's called the Alianza Hispanoamericana. I went through all that for a reason. That's because in 1960, you have the presidential election and you have an Irish Catholic running for president, with emphasis on the Catholic, because at that time, the overwhelming majority of Mexicanos or Puerto Ricanos were Catholic. And I'd venture to say it's still pretty much the case. So what happens is the Alianza Hispanoamericana joins with others to form Viva Kennedy clubs. And what happens is that the margin for victory for President Kennedy was so small, everyone paid attention to the impact of the Latino vote. And so by 1968, you have the declaration that we should have a Hispanic Heritage Week, beginning on September 15th. And that comes out of California for good reason. Now, so we have Hispanic Heritage Week. And then later, in 1988, a representative from California and a senator from Illinois, many people don't realize how large the population of Mexicanos, Latinos is in Chicago. They present the idea for Hispanic Heritage Month. So in 1988, we get this month. And keep in mind that this is for political reasons, because you want to make sure you got this growing population on your side. Commercial reasons, because, you got to sell to them, and they're an increasing market, and they're also productive within the market. And the third thing is, it goes down to, I'm sure we're going to be talking about this, the impact of having young kids come to understand not only that who they are, but the important role that their heritage has played in making this, at this point, the greatest country in the world. We had a lot to do with it. So that's just a quick intro into this, the reason for this, or at least three purposes. Okay.
So who declared it? Who declared that the month, Hispanic Heritage Month?
Well, the Congress passed a resolution, declaring it, and then the president would every year renew this pledge. Okay. It's part of the national government. As a matter of fact, you can go to HispanicHeritage.org. It's really a federal government website that gives you all the background of the Hispanic heritage. And I'll venture to say one other thing. Even though it encompasses so many people, different groups, increasingly from other parts of Latin America, in Arizona, the majority has always been Mexicanos, Norteños, Sonorenses, and then with the arrival of the railroad people from the center of Mexico to build this country.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Pete Dimas, a historian. You're a professor. You have your PhD. Thank you so very much. Much appreciate. Great history. I know you just kind of went through it in an outline form. You're loaded with this kind of information, and you even wrote, you're doing a documentary about this. And hopefully at the end, remind me, please, to say just a little something about it. But Frank and Petra, so that was the history. So let's come to the what. What do we celebrate? I mean, there's just so much about us in this country that I almost feel, I just wonder if there's groups that get together to strategize as to how to get the community to really understand who we are, right? We are a lot, and a lot of times I feel we're distracted. We don't really know who we are and what we are in this country. That's why these programs are so critical. What are we celebrating, Petra? What are we celebrating, Frank? Or what do we celebrate? Or why?
Well, I'll kick off. We're celebrating the contributions that the Mexican people have made to this country. We're proud of being Americans, but we also have a very, very proud of our heritage, of who we are, where we came from. And I think a lot of people don't realize how important that is. If you don't have a sense of where you come from, you somehow lose where you're going to go. And so it's very important. If somebody is born and says that they have English descent and so on, and they're tied to George Washington, but we're not in that line. The line that we are in is los Mexicanos. And I think it's interesting to note, I'm going to quote Pete here on a statement Pete once said, "I didn't cross the border crossed me."
Right.
And the fact that, like, my family was here when Arizona and California was part of Mexico. And they suffered. My grandmother's brother was killed by Apaches trying to settle Arizona. And when we became part of the United States, we transitioned into the United States, but we kept our pride of our past and our heritage, and that's important. We all. So many Mexicans. My dad was one of them. My dad was a member of Post 41, and he served in World War II. How many Mexican Americans died in World War I, World War II, Vietnam? The number is much larger than most people really understand. They keep thinking that somebody crossed the border and that they didn't serve, but no, this goes way back. Mexicanos have been here when it was part of Mexico. We continued as it became part of the United States, and we served and died in defense of the land that we live in. And that's an important. Kids need to know that. They need to know their heritage and who they are. I just would also like to emphasize my mother's side goes way back. They were my mother lived for a long time in Southern California. My grandmother, lived in Southern California. She was in Arizona when it was all part of Mexico. But on my dad's side, my family's in Tecate, Mexico, right on the border.
Of course.
Where they make Tecate beer. But my grandparents, my grandfather and my grandmother were Mexican citizens from Tecate. And my grandfather was working in California at the time my dad was born. They went back to Mexico. My dad grew up in the Tijuana area. Then when he got of age, my grandparents had money. They sent him to school in Los Angeles. And of course, my dad, when World War II broke out, he volunteered to fight in defense of the country that he was born in. And again, all of this information is unfortunately not known. I firmly believe, and I know that it's important to know about the Constitution and all of that, but it's also important, if you're living in Arizona, to know the history of what occurred right here in Arizona and in California. Unfortunately, that's not done. It's just, we have the Constitution and this, but you know what? There's a whole bunch of history that got left out. And, and the kids need to know it, and they need to take pride in the history of the Mexicano and the history of Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas.
Petra.
There's a lot of stories, I think, that we all carried with us, and I do think those are the things that are important to our families. I go around talking about that. My family has 6 generations here in the United States.
Mm.
You're right. We did cross the border. We like the border crossed us. And my great grandmother, her name was Mercedes Gonzalez, was born in the mid 1800s,
Hmm.
and then her daughter, my grandmother, was Isabel Rodriguez, and she was born in the late 1800s. And then my mother, Eugenia Torres, was born in the early 1900s. And my grandmother lived to be 99. My mother lived to be 79. And then I'm fourth generation American, if you want to
Mm.
call it that,
Right.
Mexican American. And then and then I have 2 daughters, and then I now have a a granddaughter. And so my 2-year-old granddaughter was actually born in Texas, just like my great grandmother and my grandmother. So again, it goes full circle about how we're connected in the history of the United States. But we are American, but we claim our history as Mexican American. And I think that's important that we grab that whole notion of being Mexican American, because I think there is a disconnect between Mexican Americans and today's immigrant. And we need to figure out what is going to connect them for the long run. And it is our story. It is knowing that we crossed the river, we crossed the desert, and we're now here working together to make sure that there is a future for the Latino community. And if you want to call yourself Hispanic or Latinx, I think all of those terms divide us even more so than we already are, by language, by economics, by education. So I just think we've got a lot of issues as a Latino Mexicano community that we need to address. But in terms of story, yeah, I'm there's 6 generations of my family here on this earth and on this
Amazing.
ground. And we'll probably have several more generations here. So I just think, how do we link those stories so that we can preserve who we are? And it is about language. It is about what we celebrate, the food that we eat, the food that we know how to cook, and that we pass all of those pieces down to our families. However, with that said, I also think, and we talked about this last week, is how do we also learn how to govern, and how do we learn how to lead not only our communities, but our country? I mean, there was a statistic that I just learned recently. Out of the 160,000 people that grew the state of Arizona's population in the last decade, 42% of those were Latino. 42% of the growth in Arizona in the last decade were Latino. And I'm sure
those are the ones that were counted.
And I was just going to say that. And if they were counted because of COVID, people weren't opening their doors. They weren't really savvy on the digital stuff. So again, we're here, and I don't think we're going to go away. We're not going to go away. But in terms of history, I think it's a narrative that we are now shaping the future of this country, the future of this state. And I think we need to own it, and we need to be prepared for it. And part of it starts with talking about our roots. Who are we? Where did we come from? And why do we celebrate our culture? Why do we celebrate, what we wear? How do we celebrate the jewelry we wear? I mean, there's all these pieces that make us who we are. And I think the more we invest in that, the more that we're proud of that. And I used la palabra de Frank Barrios for the last show was orgullo. I mean, it's an orgullo to be who we are. We have to carry it on our chest. We have to carry it everywhere. And so I just think what we're doing right now is so important for my children, my grandchildren, and everybody else's children and grandchildren. I waited 21 years to have a granddaughter, and I'm just so enamored with my 2-year-old granddaughter, because she's dark haired and she's just a beautiful young Latina little lady, and I'm looking forward to her growing in the next 20 years that I think I'm still going to be around. So again,
good.
We still have a long time to do, a lot to do yet.
So Frank, I know we spoke about this on our last show in Spanish. Can you take us through some of the industries in which Latinos have been key in building this state, building this nation? Take us through that if you don't mind.
Well, I'm going to concentrate on Arizona because that's where I am and that's what I know. But you have agriculture, you have mining, you have development. And if you look at all of these industries that have contributed, at one time we had, what was it, the 5 C's of Arizona, copper, cattle, cotton, and so on. But
climate.
That's right, and climate is one of them. But in the base of all of those industries that created Arizona, you're going to find the Mexican worker. Mm. He was in every one of those industries and played a major part on it. Look at our mining communities. You go to the mining communities, it was almost all Mexicanos that were working there. That agriculture, the same thing. What cattle, the Mexican cowboys, and yet, that's not information that is widely known. Mm. I think if you go to the movies, there's John Wayne running cattle somewhere. But in reality, through the Southwest, it was the Mexican labor that built the industries and the triumphs that occurred throughout the Southwest. And very little credit. In fact, one of the latest projects I'm involved in is trying to protect a Mexican-American cemetery called the Fratello Herd Cemetery in South Phoenix. There's close to 400 Mexican Americans buried there, and you couldn't even tell it's a cemetery. Mm. And all of them were laborers that worked, cowboys, agricultural, and their children, and yet no respect, no nothing. We're trying now to get it into the city of Phoenix, and we're going to try to get enough funds to build a fence and then give respect to these people who were who gave so much to the development of Arizona.
So according to the census, if I'm not mistaken, we are about 320 million in the U.S. I think 62 of those 320 are of Hispanic descent or are Hispanic Latinos, not Latinx. That's a huge number. So what I'm hearing is that just by virtue of who we are, by virtue of just being here, even before this was the United States, even before this was Arizona, then we see the industries in which the Latinos have been key, Mexicans and other Central American folks in South America and Caribbean. So the agriculture, the mining, the construction. But I want us to touch 2 more items and then we'll finish. We don't want to make this program too long. Petra, well, let me go to Pete. How about in the educational arena, Pete? How are we doing in education? And then I'm going to ask Petra to take us through a little bit of the history about politically how we have advanced and where we're at this point. Take it away, Pete, if you don't mind.
Well, educationally, especially in the subject that we're discussing, been horrible. I mean, if you want to teach students about the background, it's important because you have to be able to see yourself, to view how your future can go and how you fit in. And that's part of the history that we're talking about. What was it 10 years ago? In the middle of that 1070 craze, you have the state of Arizona, in its wisdom, basically declared Chicano history, Mexican American history illegal. You couldn't teach it because somehow it was very scary. But the fact of the matter is, you have to have that kind of background so that you can prepare people to move into those positions of leadership. You have to understand what has happened so you can really understand how the systems work. So once you do that, then you can understand how you can impact on it. And that's how you prepare leaders. And I must say that education is very, very important, but many people confuse education with training. And training prepares you for a job that may or may not be there. But education provides a vision of the world that allows you to interact and make the changes that you need, and be prepared to make those sorts of things happen. I wanted to go back to one thing that you were talking about earlier about the census. And I know Petra, you mentioned about the counts, and I looked at some of these things, and of the population of Mexicanos and Latinos increased 23% in the 10 years. And those are the ones that were counted. And I'm going to go back to this real quick. While the rest of the population grew by 7%. So you understand, and we're not talking about people who are coming across the border. We're talking about naturally generated, people. So you have that happen. And yet, with that count, I have to bring up Somerton, because Somerton, it's growing by leaps and bounds. They have to build a new high school. Their tax base is going up dramatically. But according to the census, they lost 90 people. Interesting. So, and understand that all of these things deal with funding, with the resources that are important for education. And I'll say one more thing here. Education, school districts, that's the most immediate political subdivision. But education is a political act. It is. You determine, what do you want them to learn? What books do you use? Those things are critical, and yet we have a legislature that is basically underfunding education. And if you understand that the majority of the students in the grade schools are Chicano, Latino, Mexicano, that's our future. And we're shortchanging that future, not just for them, but for all of us. Because let me ask you something. We're going to become the majority. Who's going to fill those positions, number one? Number two, for those people who say we don't need them, answer me this question. Who's going to pay for your retirement? How do you develop the excess resources to be able to pay people because they're too old to work? I mean, this is a self-interest that people don't see. Right. And we have a lot to do in education, but it also deals with politics. What a nice transition to Petra.
So Petra, help us briefly. Again, we don't want to make this program too long, but I mean, just take us through some of the leaders that have really paid a price to set the ground for the situation that we have today. I mean, I see the number of legislators that we have in Arizona. It's just mind-boggling. But take us through the history of some of the folks that set the ground, that laid the foundation for this.
Well, I can just start with my own history. The very first person I met was Ed Pastor, and he was in law school at the time. And of course, then he ran for the county board of supervisor, and then went on to run for Congress. Joe Eddie Lopez, I met him, and he was running for Congress. I remember going to a meeting at Friendly House, and it was a lot of people from all across the state, and he was one of the very early persons that had the courage to run for Congress. And I remember him saying, "Look, guys, you're going to hear me say things that don't sound like me, but I have to say some of those things because I just cannot relate to Mexicanos. I have to relate to everybody." Right. And then you have Raul Grijalva. He started out as a school board member in Tucson, and then now he's a member of Congress. So you have people now in our ranks that have really, like you said, paid the price and really crafted that pathway for other people to have the courage to run, because it's not just about getting people to vote for you. It's about being able to have enough money to run. And anymore, it takes so much more money than in the decades before to people run for public office. So it's just getting tougher for people, again, because the economy isn't right it's not equal in our population, that our candidates are struggling to really get out of the gate, if they've even gotten to the gate or gotten to the table, which is school boards or city council or even the state legislature. That step beyond that is really, really going to be tough for our community, because it's now become a financial game. And again, we still don't. We're probably the largest city in the state of in the country that has not yet been able to elect a person of color to the city to be mayor of our community. So we've got a lot of ground to cover yet to really be successful in the area of
Definitely.
governing.
Lots to celebrate, but it's a work in progress. Frank, would you conclude the show now with and this goes back to what I perceive what we have communicated here, that there is a sense of identity, knowing who you are, what you represent, that will trigger decisions as to and a vision, like Pete said, a vision, not just a trade to learn how to do something, but a vision of the world. Why is being proud of who you are important, Frank?
Well, I'd start with one word: culture. Culture is very important. Being an American, we have, if you look at it, here's the pie. A big part of it is our culture of being Americans, but also the culture of being Mexican American. And how we see things is through the eyes of how we were raised and the culture. Culture is, don't underestimate culture. You can't. It's so important. I've met people from the South, from New York City, Los Angeles, and they all bring a different culture. Even in Mexico, you go to Mexico City and versus Sonora, and you have people with different ideas, different cultures. And the key is to try to bring it all together to govern and provide justice for everybody. But unfortunately, what happens is there's also a bad culture that says, no, you're not one of us, so you can't be part of the governance. We don't want you. That's the culture you want to stamp out. The culture is that we're all Americans and we want a better world, but we see things a little different because of our culture, being Mexican Americans. And the day, I hope someday in the future, there's going to be people that see us all united. You know, in today's world, you have people from all over the world. You have Chinese, Arabs, people from Africa, people from Mexico, and we're all coming together. And what makes it work is a way that we can unite for the betterment of everybody. And that's the view that hopefully comes about, and not give you an example. Not the kind of thing that happened in Nazi Germany, where all of a sudden they're the enemy, the Jews, and guess what? We're going to govern, take over the world. You got to crush that. And unfortunately, I know I'm not going to get political on you, but in today's world, it's my way or the highway. And that vision gets stomped out. We've got to somehow find a way to look at us as united towards a goal that preserves the health and well-being of everybody in this country.
Excellent way to finish our show, Frank. Let me just read something that we here at AARP came up with for this occasion of the Hispanic Heritage Month. We are entrelazados. Latinos are like, Latinos are like millions of threads, each connected through their Hispanic heritage. Individually and collectively, they strengthen the fabric of this nation, bringing color, vibrancy, passion, and flavor to their communities and beyond. And AARP wants to ensure that they continue to weave prosperous futures filled with salud, dinero, y amor. Well, we should conclude the show. I want to thank Pete Dimas, Frank Barrios, and Petra Falcon. I'm telling you, you're not only are you a wealth of information, but your passion, and you have lived it. And I honestly want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you've done for our communities and you continue to do. So thank you very much, Pete, Frank, and Petra.
Thank you.
Yes, I'd like to add something if you have time.
Yes, of course.
If people are interested in the history,
Hmm.
we have a documentary series I have to break up into 11 segments that's available free to anybody who wants to view it on the Bronze Sacred Heart Center website. It's bronzesacredheartcenter.org/documentary series. No cost. It's just that you have to look at me introduce it 11 times. But other than that, and the first one is a very long intro, but after that, it's all very straightforward, broken down to 11 sections. And it gets us from the very beginning, from pre-Columbia, all the way up to the 1920s, where we have the imposition of segregation. And we talk about all those things that Frank was talking about, dealing with what it took to develop Arizona. So I just wanted to spread that word.
Definitely worth it. Were you going to say anything else, Petra? You're okay?
No,
Go ahead.
I'm fine. I just think the point that both Frank and Pete make is about how do we document our story or our narrative. We are so embedded, and you say that in your little intro with the AARP about the richness of our narrative, and that we are weaved in the narrative of the state of Arizona for different reasons. And I also think because we are in the Southwest and not the East Coast, the East Coast has a whole different trajectory in terms of their story. But the Southwest, we are truly, truly in the roots of that history. So I think it's important that people like Frank and Pete really write this story, because somebody has to write it.
Go ahead, Frank.
Add that thank AARP for allowing us to tell our story, and to, it's a way for this message to get out there. And again, thank you, David. Thank you, AARP, for providing the mechanism for these stories to go out. Thank you.
And last thing, Frank, you also wrote a book, right? It's called Mexicans of Phoenix. And how can people get your book? Can they look them up in Amazon?
Yeah, Amazon, Arcadia Publishing. There it is.
There it is.
I also have a copy.
Oh,
well, there's
the author about this one.
I'm telling you, every time we touch history, I get excited. I love it. It's just you relive, and the inspiration and motivation just springs up from your being. So this concludes the end of our show. Stay tuned, because we will have more shows on Hispanic Heritage Month. And again, enjoy the whole month. We have a whole month to talk about it, to celebrate it. So thank you again, and see you next time. Take care.
Feliz día. Bye.
Bye.